The truth about powerful people is this: they never panic unless they recognize you. Margaret Ellis heard those words from her father more than 50 years ago, but she never imagined she would remember them while standing alone in a crowded courtroom in downtown Chicago on a rainy Thursday morning. The courthouse lobby smelled like wet coats and burnt coffee as attorneys hurried past her in $1,000 suits without making eye contact. At 68 years old, Margaret looked invisible to almost everyone there. Her grey wool coat had been pressed neatly the night before, but it was old. Her leather purse had faded around the edges. The young security guard barely glanced at her ID before waving her through with the same tired expression people used for women they assumed didn't matter anymore. Upstairs, courtroom 4B was already packed with reporters, legal assistants, and businessmen whispering over stacks of documents. A high-profile civil lawsuit always attracted attention, especially when millions of dollars were involved. Margaret paused outside the wooden doors for just a moment as voices echoed inside. She could hear her son laughing. That sound alone almost made her turn around and leave. Almost. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and walked in quietly. The conversations inside softened for a second as people noticed her, then quickly resumed once they decided she was nobody important. A young attorney standing near the front frowned when he saw her approaching the plaintiff's table. He said politely, though his smile looked forced. Family visitors usually sit in the back rows. Margaret looked at the empty chair beside the lead attorney and gently placed her purse on the table. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied calmly. The attorney blinked in confusion while another woman nearby gave a small laugh under her breath. Across the courtroom, Margaret's son finally noticed her. Richard Ellis froze for half a second before quickly looking away. That hurt more than she expected. He was wearing a navy suit she recognized immediately because she had bought it for him 3 Christmases ago. Beside him sat his wife Chloe, elegant and perfectly styled, whispering something into his ear while glancing toward Margaret with visible annoyance. Chloe leaned closer and quietly asked, "Why is she here?" Richard avoided answering. Margaret pretended not to notice. She folded her hands neatly on the table and looked ahead at the judge's empty bench. The giant courtroom clock ticked loudly above the room while people shuffled papers and checked their phones. Nobody paid attention to the elderly woman sitting where lawyers usually sat today. Nobody except the court clerk, who walked over nervously holding a clipboard. "Excuse me, she whispered carefully, "are you representing someone today?" Margaret lifted her eyes slowly. "No," she said. "They just haven't realized yet that this case belongs to me." The clerk stared at her, confused, before footsteps echoed from the side entrance behind the bench. The bailiff's voice rang through the courtroom. "All rise." And the moment Judge Harrison Cole walked into the room and saw Margaret Ellis sitting there waiting for him, the color drained from his face. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, just as I had every day for more than 30 years. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock Noel had hung in the kitchen shortly after we moved in. For a moment, lying in bed, I forgot everything. Then reality settled over me again. Noel was gone. And somehow, in the span of a single week, my own son had begun acting like a stranger. The changes were subtle at first. Small enough that another person might have dismissed them. But when you spend decades raising someone, you notice every shift in their voice, every hesitation in their eyes. Wade no longer lingered when we spoke. He no longer asked how I was sleeping or whether I needed groceries. Every conversation felt rushed, as if he had somewhere more important to be. Romy, meanwhile, moved through the house with an ownership that unsettled me. She opened cabinets without asking. She rearranged things Noel and I had kept the same for years. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and noticed several framed family photographs missing from the bookshelf. My stomach tightened. I found them stacked in a cardboard box near the garage. When I asked Romy about it, she smiled casually. I thought the room would look more modern without so much clutter. Clutter. That was the word she used for 30 years of family memories. A few days later, I discovered that the guest bedroom had been emptied. Furniture that belonged to Noel's parents had disappeared. The quilt my mother stitched by hand decades ago had been folded into a storage bin. Nobody had asked my permission. Nobody had even mentioned it. I stood in that room for several minutes, staring at the bare walls. The emptiness felt deliberate. Like they were already preparing the house for a future that did not include me. That evening, Wade arrived carrying several folders. He and Romy sat at the dining room table whispering while I washed dishes in the kitchen. Every time I entered the room, the conversation stopped. Every time I left, it resumed. Their voices were low, careful, secretive. I caught fragments of sentences. Property taxes. Renovations. Market value. My name was never mentioned. Neither was Noel's. Yet somehow I knew they were talking about this house. The house I had scrubbed, painted, repaired, and loved for more than 3 decades. Later that night, I went to retrieve some important documents from the study. When I opened the small wall safe Noel and I had always used, the keypad flashed red. Invalid code. I tried again. Invalid code. A cold sensation crept through my chest. The code had not changed in 20 years. I checked the numbers carefully and entered them again. Nothing. The safe had been reprogrammed. I sat there staring at the metal door, unable to move. Someone had changed the code without telling me. The next morning, I asked Wade about it. He barely looked up from his phone. Oh, that. I updated the security settings. Just trying to keep things organized. Organized. Another harmless word that somehow felt threatening. You could have told me, I said quietly. I forgot. He shrugged. It's not a big deal, Mom. But it was a big deal. Not because of the safe itself. Because every change seemed designed to send the same message. This is no longer your home. This is no longer your life. By the end of that week, I stopped asking questions. Not because I trusted them. Because I was beginning to understand something much worse. They were not acting impulsively. They were following a plan. A plan they had likely discussed long before that terrible dinner conversation. As I stood at the kitchen window one evening watching the sun disappear behind the maple trees Noel had planted years ago, a single thought settled heavily in my mind. They were preparing for my departure long before they ever informed me. And for the first time, I found myself wondering exactly what else they had been hiding. I sat alone in Noel's study long after sunset, surrounded by things that still carried traces of him. His reading chair remained beside the window. His favorite fountain pen rested exactly where he had left it. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses sat on top of an old woodworking magazine. Everything looked untouched, yet somehow everything felt different. The room no longer felt like a place of comfort. It felt like the last corner of the house where I could still hear his voice. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk and found a stack of greeting cards tied together with a faded blue ribbon. They stretched back nearly 20 years. Anniversary cards. Birthday notes. Little messages he had written when words seemed easier on paper than in conversation. I ran my fingers across his familiar handwriting. The sight of it made my chest ache. Noel had never been a man of grand speeches. His love lived in smaller things. A cup of coffee waiting beside my chair every morning. The way he always warmed my car during winter. The way he squeezed my hand twice whenever we crossed a crowded parking lot. I unfolded one card dated 12 years earlier. Inside, he had written, "No matter what happens, this home will always belong to us. We built it together. We will always be a team." I stared at those words for a long time. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the maple trees. Inside, silence settled around me. Memories began surfacing one after another. Noel painting the nursery before Wade was born. Noel teaching our son how to ride a bicycle on the sidewalk in front of the house. Noel spending entire weekends repairing the porch because he wanted everything perfect for family gatherings. We built this life together, one paycheck at a time. One sacrifice at a time. There were years when money was tight. Years when vacations were impossible. Years when we counted every dollar. Yet we never complained because we believed we were building something lasting. Something that would protect our family long after we were gone. I remembered one evening several years before his death. We had been sitting on the back deck watching fireflies blink across the yard. Noel had become unusually serious. He looked toward the house and said quietly, "Promise me something." I asked what he meant. He smiled and took my hand. "Promise me you will never let anyone make you feel like you do not belong here." At the time, I laughed and told him he was being dramatic. Nobody could ever make me feel that way. This was our home, our family, our future. Now, sitting alone in his study, those words returned with painful clarity. It was as if he had seen something I had missed. As if he understood how quickly loyalty could change once grief entered a house. I wiped a tear from my cheek and carefully placed the cards back into the drawer. The sadness remained, but something else appeared beside it. Determination. Noel had spent his entire life protecting me. Even now, through old letters and fading memories, he was still trying to remind me who I was. I was not a guest in this house. I was not an obstacle standing in someone else's way. I was the woman who had built this home alongside him. And for the first time since the funeral, I realized I could still hear his final lesson. Do not surrender what is yours simply because someone else demands it. 2 days later, I drove to the grocery store just after lunch. It was one of those ordinary errands that normally required no thought at all. I picked up bread, milk, coffee, and a few ingredients for soup. The kind of shopping Noel and I used to do together every Thursday. As I loaded the bags into my trunk, I heard someone call my name. "Myrtle?" I turned and saw Evelyn Harper walking toward me. Evelyn had been my neighbor for nearly 20 years before moving across town after her husband retired. She was 73, sharp as ever, and the sort of woman who noticed things other people missed. We exchanged a brief hug and stood talking beside our cars. At first the conversation was pleasant. Weather, health, retirement, the usual subjects. Then her expression changed slightly. "I hope you do not mind me asking," she said carefully, "but are you really moving away?" My stomach tightened immediately. "Moving away?" I repeated. "Who told you that?" Evelyn hesitated. I assumed it was true. Romy mentioned it at church last Sunday. For a moment I simply stared at her. What exactly did she say? Evelyn looked uncomfortable. She said you had decided to sell the house and move into a senior community. She said the transition was already underway. The parking lot suddenly felt very quiet. Cars moved around us. Shopping carts rattled across pavement. Yet all I could hear was Evelyn's voice repeating those words. The transition was already underway. "I never told anyone I was moving," I said slowly. Evelyn frowned. Then perhaps I misunderstood. But I could see from her face that she had not misunderstood anything. Romy had been speaking about my future as if the decision had already been made. Without me. Without my consent. Evelyn placed a gentle hand on my arm. "There is something else." I waited. A few weeks before Noel passed, I overheard Romy and another woman talking after service. I was not eavesdropping. They were standing right behind me. She paused. Romy mentioned that once certain paperwork was finalized, the property would finally become available for renovations. My pulse quickened. "What paperwork?" Evelyn shook her head. "I do not know. I only remember thinking it sounded strange." We stood in silence for several seconds. Then Evelyn looked directly into my eyes. "Myrtle, forgive me if I am overstepping, but something about the conversation bothered me. It sounded less like concern for your future and more like planning." Planning. The same word that had been forming quietly in my mind for days. Suddenly the missing photographs, the empty guest room, the changed safe code, the whispered conversations, and the strange references to market value all felt connected. Pieces of a puzzle slowly locking together. Evelyn squeezed my hand. "You have always been kind to everyone. Do not let anyone rush you into decisions you are not ready to make." I thanked her and finished loading my groceries. On the drive home, I barely noticed the traffic lights. My thoughts kept circling back to one question. How long had this been happening? When I pulled into the driveway, Wade's truck was already there. Through the front window, I could see him and Romy sitting at the dining room table surrounded by papers. Neither of them noticed me. I remained in the car for a full minute, watching silently. For the first time, I no longer felt confused. I no longer felt uncertain. Whatever they were planning had begun long before Noel's funeral. And thanks to Evelyn, I finally knew I was not imagining it. That evening, I carried the grocery bags inside and acted as though nothing had changed. Wade glanced up briefly before returning to the papers spread across the dining room table. Romy offered a quick smile that never reached her eyes. Neither of them asked about my day. Neither seemed interested in where I had been. I quietly put away the groceries and retreated to my room. For the first time, I stopped waiting for answers to come to me. If something was being hidden, I needed facts. Not suspicions. Not assumptions. Facts. The next morning, after Wade and Romy left the house, I drove downtown to the small law office where Noel had handled most of our estate planning years earlier. The building looked exactly the same. Red brick walls. Brass lettering near the entrance. A waiting room filled with old magazines and comfortable chairs. When I introduced myself to the receptionist, her expression softened immediately. She remembered Noel. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting across from Mr. Calloway, the attorney who had known our family for more than 15 years. He listened carefully as I explained everything. The changed safe code. The conversations about selling the house. The comments made by Romy at church. The pressure building around me from every direction. When I finished speaking, he folded his hands and remained silent for several seconds. Myrtle, he said carefully, have you personally reviewed Noel's final estate documents since his passing? I admitted that I had not. Between the funeral arrangements and my grief, I had trusted that everything would be handled properly. Mr. Calloway nodded slowly. Then he opened a file cabinet and retrieved a thick folder. My heart began beating faster. Inside were copies of documents Noel had signed less than a year before his death. Mr. Calloway reviewed them page by page. Occasionally he paused to explain legal language in plain English. Then he stopped at a specific section and slid the paper across the desk toward me. You should read this part. I adjusted my glasses and read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. According to Noel's signed estate plan, I retained legal rights to remain in the home indefinitely. No sale could be forced without my written consent. No transfer could occur without my approval. The property protections were clear. Unmistakable. My hands trembled slightly as I looked up. So they cannot simply decide to sell it. Mr. Calloway shook his head. Not legally. A strange mixture of relief and concern washed over me. Relief because Noel had protected me exactly as he promised. Concern because Wade and Romy either did not understand these protections or were hoping I did not. Mr. Calloway leaned forward. I would recommend gathering copies of all relevant documents and keeping them somewhere secure. Secure. The word echoed in my mind. For weeks I had felt powerless. Now, for the first time, I possessed something stronger than emotion. I possessed information. When I left the office carrying a folder of copies under my arm, the sky seemed brighter than it had in weeks. The fear was not gone. Neither was the sadness. But uncertainty had begun to disappear. As I drove home, I realized something important. Wade and Romy believed I was grieving too deeply to pay attention. They believed I would simply accept whatever future they presented to me. What they did not know was that I had finally started looking beneath the surface. And what I was finding was changing everything. For the next several days, I said very little. I followed my normal routine. I made coffee each morning. I watered the flowers near the back porch. I folded laundry and prepared simple dinners. On the surface, nothing appeared different. But inside, everything had changed. I was paying attention now. Every conversation. Every glance. Every detail. The folder from Mr. Calloway remained hidden safely inside a locked drawer at the local bank. I wanted no chance of important documents mysteriously disappearing. One evening, I was carrying a basket of clean towels down the hallway when I heard voices coming from the dining room. Wade and Romy were speaking quietly, but the house was unusually still. Their words carried farther than they realized. I stopped before turning the corner. The realtor said spring would be the best time, Romy said. The market is still strong. My grip tightened on the towels. There was a brief silence before Wade answered. We cannot do anything until she agrees. Romy sighed heavily. Then we need to make her understand that staying here is unrealistic. I felt something cold settle inside me. Not shock. Not anger. Confirmation. They were discussing my future as if I were a problem to solve. A complication standing between them and something they wanted. I quietly returned to my room before they noticed me. That night, sleep came slowly. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every strange moment from the past month. The safe code. The missing photographs. The rumors at church. The conversations about renovations. Now there was talk of realtors. Every piece pointed in the same direction. The next morning, another surprise arrived. I opened the mailbox and found a glossy brochure from a retirement community located about 40 miles away. The front cover showed smiling seniors walking through landscaped gardens. Across the top, bold letters read, "Your next chapter starts here." My stomach dropped. I had never requested information from any retirement community. I had never contacted one. Yet somehow the brochure had been mailed directly to me. When I stepped inside the house, I found Romy in the kitchen. She glanced at the brochure in my hand and smiled. Oh good. It finally arrived. The words landed like a stone. You ordered this? I asked. I was only trying to help, she replied quickly. There are wonderful opportunities there. Activities. Friends. A simpler lifestyle. I looked at her carefully. She sounded prepared. Rehearsed. As if she had practiced the conversation in advance. I am not planning to move, I said calmly. Her smile faded for just a second before returning. Of course. I understand. But I could tell she did not understand at all. Or perhaps she simply did not care. Later that afternoon, I sat on the back deck with a cup of tea. The maple trees swayed gently in the breeze. Birds moved between branches. Everything looked peaceful. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, something important had shifted. For weeks, I had been reacting to events as they happened. Now I could finally see the larger picture. Wade and Romy were not making random decisions. They were building pressure little by little, hoping I would eventually surrender on my own. What they failed to realize was that every new attempt only strengthened my resolve. Because with each passing day, their intentions became harder to hide. And the more clearly I saw their plan, the more determined I became to protect the life Noel and I had built together. 3 days later, the moment I had been expecting finally arrived. It happened on a Sunday evening after dinner. The dishes had been cleared away, and the three of us sat around the dining room table. Wade looked unusually nervous. Romy kept smoothing invisible wrinkles from the front of her sweater. I recognized the signs immediately. They had rehearsed this conversation. Wade cleared his throat. Mom, there is something we wanted to discuss. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. We have been thinking about what is best for everyone moving forward. The phrase sounded polished. Corporate. Detached. Not the voice of a son speaking to his mother. Romy leaned forward slightly. We know this house holds memories, but maintaining a property this size can become overwhelming. There it was. The opening move. I said nothing. Silence often reveals more than arguments ever do. Wade continued. There are some wonderful communities designed specifically for people in your stage of life. People in your stage of life. Another carefully chosen phrase. I almost smiled. For weeks, they had been laying the groundwork. Now they were finally saying it aloud. We even found a few places nearby, Romy added. You would have neighbors, activities, transportation services. Everything would be much easier. Easier for whom, I wondered. Me, or them? I glanced around the dining room. The same room where Wade had celebrated birthdays as a child. The same room where Noel and I hosted Thanksgiving dinners for decades. The same room where I had been told to grieve, pack my bags, and never come back. Strange how familiar spaces could suddenly feel so unfamiliar. And what would happen to the house? I asked quietly. Wade exchanged a quick glance with Romy. A glance they probably thought I would not notice. We would figure that out, he said. There are options. Options. Such a small word. Yet loaded with meaning. I nodded slowly, as if considering the idea for the first time. In truth, I had already heard enough. More than enough. The realtor conversations. The church rumors. The retirement brochures. Every piece fit together perfectly now. They were not offering possibilities. They were presenting a destination they had already chosen. The only thing missing was my agreement. I appreciate your concern, I said calmly. Relief flashed across Romy's face. She thought I was surrendering. But I am not interested in moving. The relief disappeared instantly. Wade shifted in his chair. Mom, maybe you should think about it. I have thought about it, I replied. Quite a lot, actually. The room became very still. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Romy forced another smile. Of course. There is no rush. But we all knew that was not true. There had been a rush from the beginning. A quiet, steady campaign disguised as concern. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Wade retreated to the living room. Romy disappeared. Upstairs. I remained at the table alone. Yet unlike the lonely woman who had sat there weeks earlier after Noel's funeral, I no longer felt powerless. For the first time, their intentions had been spoken aloud. No more guessing. No more uncertainty. They had shown me exactly where they stood. And because of that, I finally knew what I needed to do next. Not react. Not argue. Not plead. Prepare. Because the next move would belong to me. The morning after that conversation, I woke with a sense of clarity I had not felt in months. The fear that had followed me since Noel's funeral was beginning to fade. In its place was something steadier. Resolve. I made my coffee, carried it onto the back porch, and watched the sun rise above the maple trees. The air was cool. The yard was quiet. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to think beyond the immediate crisis. I thought about the years Noel and I had spent building our life. I thought about the sacrifices we had made to provide stability for our family. Most of all, I thought about how easily that history had been reduced to a financial opportunity in the eyes of people who had not built it. Later that week, I returned to Mr. Calloway's office. This time, I arrived with a notebook full of questions. I wanted to understand every detail of my legal position. Every protection Noel had put in place. Every document connected to the property and estate. Mr. Calloway patiently walked me through everything. The more I learned, the more confident I became. Noel had been thorough. There were safeguards I had never even known existed. Before leaving, I asked him one final question. If someone attempted to pressure me into giving up my rights, what should I do? He looked at me carefully before answering. You do not owe anyone an immediate decision. You do not owe anyone an explanation. And you certainly do not owe anyone your silence. Those words stayed with me all the way home. That evening, I began organizing decades of records. Property documents. Insurance papers. Tax records. Family correspondence. I worked slowly and carefully. As I sorted through old files, I discovered several letters Noel had written. During different stages of our marriage. One sentence appeared repeatedly in various forms. Protect what we built. Reading those words felt almost like receiving advice from him one last time. Meanwhile, Wade and Romy seemed increasingly impatient. Small comments began appearing more often. Remarks about downsizing. Observations about maintenance costs. Casual references to retirement communities. Each comment sounded harmless on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Yet I responded the same way every time. Calmly. Politely. Without revealing what I knew. One afternoon, I overheard Romy speaking on the phone in the kitchen. I was not trying to listen. I simply happened to enter the room at the wrong moment. The instant she noticed me, her conversation stopped. She ended the call almost immediately. The reaction told me more than any words could have. There were still discussions happening behind closed doors. Plans being made without my involvement. But instead of feeling hurt, I felt prepared. They believed they were controlling the situation. They believed I remained unaware. That misunderstanding had become my greatest advantage. As the days passed, I continued gathering information and quietly strengthening my position. I was no longer reacting to events. I was anticipating them. Watching. Learning. Waiting. Because deep down, I sensed that Wade and Romy were approaching a moment when they would stop hinting and start demanding. And when that moment arrived, they were going to discover that the grieving widow they had underestimated was no longer standing alone. Noel's preparations, the truth in those documents, and my own determination had given me something they never expected. The ability to say no.